Cold fusion update. There is an experiment that anyone can do that proves beyond any doubt that the fusion of atomic nuclei does happen at room temperature and normal pressure. Carbon will transmute to iron when subjected to an electric arc at room temperature. Anyone can do the experiment in their lap with two graphite pencils and a 6-volt battery. Simply connect one lead of the battery to the graphite of one pencil and the other lead to the other pencil. Rub the pencil leads together to strike an arc and observe iron sputter off. Test the sputtered ash with a magnet. Critics of the experiment suggest that carbon can become magnetic, but spectral analysis reveals not only iron, but other transmuted products in that ash. Dr. Eugene Mallove of MIT reported the carbon experiment in Infinite Energy magazine. He noted that the iron produced was named George Ohsawa steel, after Dr. Ohsawa, who discovered it. George Ohsawa steel is stainless and heat resistant due to other transmuted impurities created in the process. Transmutation of carbon to iron in the process that produces George Ohsawa steel shows that electric currents in plasma thus promote fusion reaction. The process is repeatable and has been repeated many times by many investigators. Dr. Mallove reported that real-time spectrum analysis during the process shows carbon disappear and iron appear. Dr. Ohsawa suggested that 2 carbon and 2 oxygen atoms combine to produce the iron. He and others repeated the experiment many times with various combinations of materials present. When conducted in the absence of oxygen, no iron forms. Replace the oxygen and the iron reappears. Since the carbon to iron experiment works every time by anyone who does it, it makes sense that investigations into element transmutations might begin with that. We suspect that the process might be enhanced by frequency control of the electric current. There will be some frequency that resonates with the process. Recent experiments with palladium cold fusion show that sound injected into the palladium lattice helps the process. Frequency and intensity of the sound do have an effect. Cold fusion advocate Dr. Eugene Mallove of MIT was murdered on May 14, 2004, shortly after a television interview. He was very critical of academia and suggested that there was a conspiracy between academia and the U.S. government aimed at killing cold fusion activity. 6 years later, 3 suspects were arrested and charged with the Mallove murder. The suspects were found in prison where they had been confined for drug activity. In April 2012, the courts allowed the murderers to plead guilty to the lesser crime of manslaughter. This avoided a trial that might have exposed the conspiracy. Conspiracy theorists claim that Dr. Mallove was murdered by a paid hit team because he advocated for cold fusion. Cheap energy would disrupt the world's energy providers for a time and would surely lead to new players in the global economy. Shortly before Dr. Mallove was murdered, he confronted his superiors at Massachusetts Institute of Technology with the fact that the institute had issued a false negative report about the Pons and Fleischmann experiment. The false report claimed that they could not duplicate the experiment. Dr. Mallove examined raw data from the institution's experiment and found that the data actually supported Pons and Fleischmann. Dr. Mallove resigned from MIT as a result. This was a crime against humanity by the authorities at MIT, yet no one was jailed for the crime. The careers of Drs. Pons and Dr. Fleischmann were destroyed in the United States. They continued their work in France. Others who dared to experiment in the field were forced to resign their positions. Others were murdered. This continued on into the year 2014, even though the cold fusion process was well established by that time. We can expect it to continue well into the future. Anyone who dares advance the field must take extreme care. Any nation can now develop enough clean, cheap energy to supply the world. Lockheed Martin recently announced plans to do just that. Their planned fusion device uses a magnetically confined plasma process that does not violate current theory. Current theory cannot be complete because it cannot explain the anomalies seen in current experiments. Research into cold fusion shows that many have known about it for centuries. In 1927, Drs. Friedrich Panth and Kurt Peters produced a paper on the fusion of hydrogen to helium by spontaneous nuclear catalysis when hydrogen was absorbed in a fine palladium powder. They later retracted the paper, saying the helium probably leaked into the experiment from the air. They never tried to explain the heat anomaly. Hydrogen transmutes to helium and produces about 22 million electron volts of energy per helium atom. In the 1960s, Dr. Louis Kervran of France investigated several biological transmutation processes. He noticed that chickens produced hard, calcium-rich eggshells when no calcium was present in their diet. The chickens pecked at shiny mica flakes on the ground. Dr. Kervran showed that the chickens needed potassium contained in the mica flakes to produce the hard-shelled eggs. When deprived of the mica flakes, soft-shelled eggs were produced. Dr. Kervran concluded that the chickens somehow transformed the potassium into calcium. The French government called upon Dr. Kervran to solve a problem in the shipbuilding industry. Carbon monoxide poisoning afflicted welders even though exhaustive tests showed that no carbon monoxide was present in the air they breathed. Dr. Kervran found that nitrogen, conditioned by the heat from welding torches, transmuted to carbon monoxide in lung tissue. The book Biological Transmutations by Dr. Kervran details much of his work. Dr. George Osawa published a translation of Dr. Kervran's book. It is available on the internet in PDF format from baytella.com. Academia mocked Dr. Kervran, claiming that he believed in nuclear-powered chickens. Academia used that same argument against Drs. Pons and Fleischmann. There's a so-called Coulomb barrier, which prevents nuclear fusion reactions at normal temperatures. There must then be some process that avoids the barrier. One proposed process that does not violate theory is that a proton first changes to a neutron by means of electron capture. This would be an endothermic reaction requiring enough energy input to snap an electron shell of the atom into the nucleus. The reaction process to go from hydrogen to helium would involve electron capture to produce neutrons, which then combine with normal hydrogen atoms to produce deuterium. A hydrogen atom continues to capture neutrons until it becomes unstable hydrogen-4. Hydrogen-4 then beta decays to helium-4. This differs from hot fusion, where hydrogen atoms slam together through several steps to form helium. Hot fusion yields radioactive fast neutrons. Cold fusion, which transmutes hydrogen-2 to helium-4, does not yield neutrons. Dr. Irving Langmuir invented a welding process in which hydrogen squirted through an electric arc to produce temperatures close to 4,000 degrees, hot enough to melt tungsten. This welding process was used extensively by Germany prior to World War II. In theory, the electric arc broke down hydrogen molecules H2 into hydrogen atoms H plus H. This was an endothermic reaction requiring about 300 calories per gram. However, the flame produced about 100,000 calories per gram. This anomaly went unnoticed until the 21st century. Dr. Tom Bearden noticed this anomaly in the energy produced by the Langmuir torch flame in 2003. He suggested that it might be used as an energy source. Since Dr. Bearden advocates for zero-point energy, he touted the anomaly as evidence of zero-point energy. The more likely source of the anomaly would be cold fusion, since we know that cold fusion is a reality and zero-point energy is an unproven theory. The presence of helium in the ash would settle the issue. An electric arc in a hydrogen atmosphere seems to produce an order of magnitude more energy than required to maintain the arc. This is a very explosive event, so be careful. A device to capture and use this energy would involve a hydrogen container wired to produce an electric arc inside. A jacket of water would cool the container and produce steam to power a turbine. We now witness a profound time in history when energy development will upend governments and maybe even end the death grip that academia holds on science. Instead of promoting new discovery, academia fights it. Anything that does not agree with established theory is ridiculed and trashed. A new era is upon us. We easily communicate ideas and new discovery. As many practice deception, we develop new abilities to recognize that deception. We learn to not believe anything anyone tells us, but to use the clues we find to do our own research. The only real true thing in life is that which you discover for yourself.